So first we're going to hear from Eddie Bautista. Eddie is Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. He's also a visiting assistant professor at the Pratt Institute School of Architecture, graduate programs for sustainable planning and development.
Good evening, folks. First of all, greetings from the republics of Brooklyn and the Bronx. We love us some Philly back in New York. We always learn good stuff from Philadelphia organizing whenever we come down here. Everything from one election away from the next mayor being a former union member. If we ever had a union member as mayor in New York, to John getting 12 groups, at least 12 groups, to introduce themselves in 5 minutes. In New York, we still would have been clearing our throats. You know what I'm saying? So it's just, so God bless Philly. As was mentioned, my name is Eddie Bautista. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. The Alliance is a citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the city's most environmentally overburdened communities. The South Bronx, North Brooklyn, Sunset Park, communities that, in fact, in the theme of tying all things together, people should just remember that those of us that do environmental justice work, we don't come at this as policy wonks or people who necessarily study this in school. Just remember, all the environment is where you live, work, or play, or pray. That's all that is, right? And the way our communities came to this struggle, our organization was founded in 1991 as a result of a rash of power plant waste transfer, sewage treatment plant sightings over and over and over in the same handful of communities across New York. And remember, the organizations that form the Environmental Justice Alliance in New York are youth groups, housing advocacy groups, faith-based organizations. Again, these are not organizations that necessarily went to school to learn this stuff, but are now street PhDs in the fight against climate injustices in our cities. The way the Alliance was formed was in the early 90s when these community groups started noticing these sightings. They all recognized that most of them were in former industrially, in fact, most of them are still industrially zoned communities, right? The dirty secret for a lot of our cities is that with the loss of manufacturing, what ended up getting cited in a lot of our communities was some of the most polluting infrastructure you will find in the United States. In New York City alone, we lost over 1 million, well over 1 million manufacturing jobs from the 40s to the 70s. And what replaced those jobs were low road, waste infrastructure jobs, the vast majority non-unionized, vast majority hiring people of color, immigrants, folks who are discouraged from fighting for their rights and are disproportionately suffering from the burden of not only working in these facilities, but going home in the same neighborhoods where they have to deal with these facilities. So to give you an example, New York City generates something like 36,000 tons every day of solid waste, just solid waste. About 80% of the city's waste is trucked in and out of a handful of waste transfer stations in the South Bronx, North Brooklyn, and other low-income communities and communities of color. That's just solid waste. The city's power plants, brownfields, sewage plants, sludge plants, roadways, all concentrated in our communities. That's to give you a sense, or at least a context, of how we came to the climate justice fight, okay? So our exposure to climate adaptation, resiliency, climate change, what we call climate justice, predates Sandy, predates Katrina. You actually have to go back to the 90s for us. Back in the 90s, New York City updated its coastal zone management plan. In New York, it's called the Waterfront Revitalization Program. When they updated the coastal zone management plan, they added a new category. On its surface, we thought it might be a good thing. It was an industrial retention policy. It was a designation that created something called significant maritime and industrial areas. And before I go any further, I need to always reiterate this. At least the environmental justice groups that I run with, we consider ourselves industrial retention advocates. right? This false paradigm of pitting economic development against environmental protection is too old and too played out. That's not the way we need to be rolling in this century. And in New York City, we still, more than ever, need a place where working people could raise a family. And I will tell you that based on the trends of economic development in New York, more and more working class, middle income, low income people of color having less and less in terms of economic opportunity. And at this point, you're either faced with expanding retail service sector jobs, which again, you can't really raise a family on, or the dwindling industrial retention jobs that we've been fighting for years. But that doesn't mean we compromise our environmental protection as well. So when the city introduced this designation, they did so by lowering some of the environmental standards in these 6 neighborhoods. And these 6 neighborhoods were the same ones I mentioned at the beginning: South Bronx, North Brooklyn, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and North Shore of Staten Island. So we started trying to insert environmental protection clauses in that regulatory scheme. Now, I don't know how many of you guys remember who was running New York in the 90s, but it was a guy named Rudy Giuliani. And I will tell you, the thing about environmental justice is we combine environmental sensibility with civil rights, toolboxes. And I will say that about the only thing that the Giuliani administration was more hostile to than environmental protection was civil rights. So we tried combining those two. We were going nowhere. So we lost that fight. Fast forward to 2010, the city looks to redo its coastal zone management plan again, and we figure we get another bite at the apple. See the big apple, you like that? Sorry, I won't do that again, I'm sorry. But what we have in 2010 that we didn't have in the 90s was a climate change analytical toolbox. We started looking at what the storm surge zones were in New York. And all of a sudden, we mapped all these 6 neighborhoods that have the heaviest concentration of polluting infrastructure and industrial uses. And we're talking about maybe 4,000 acres of this combined. And what we realized was that every single one of these communities were vulnerable to storm surge. And I'm not talking about category 4 hurricanes, not even category 1. I'm talking like a stiff wind. I'm talking about a rainy day. Our communities were all of a sudden, we realized, vulnerable to flooding and storm surges. Now, I'd like to think that if we were designing a city from scratch today, we wouldn't cluster all our heaviest polluting industrial and infrastructure uses all on the waterfront in the path of storm surges, right? But that's the hand we were dealt, right? So we're now dealing with 20th century, in many ways, racist or at least structures that didn't have low-income people and working people at the center of their planning paradigms, right? So we had that 20th century mess in the middle of this 21st century problem called climate change. So we started doing the analysis and started organizing and started pressing again to try to get the city to include some of these now climate adaptation and resilience, because the language changes, but the reality on the ground never seems to really, right? So we're moving along with our campaign when the city's planning commission is going to have a vote on their waterfront plan on October 29th, 2012. You guys remember what happened October 29th? Sandy hits. They had to cancel the hearing on the waterfront plan because of a severe weather event. We couldn't make this stuff up, right? So all of a sudden, a lot of the work that we were doing went into from pre-disaster planning to post-disaster relief and adaptation and resiliency, now urgency, that we had been warning the city for years about. Just to give you an example, the amount of people that live within a half mile of these communities is about 622,000 New Yorkers, right? Within a half mile of these industrial neighborhoods that live right next to them. About 422,000 of them are people of color. If you look at the impacts of Sandy, just from public housing alone, over 30% of all of public housing in New York City was impacted by Sandy. That's over 400 buildings, that's over 35,000 units. I can give you statistic after statistic, but there is no denying that when Sandy hit, the disproportionality for people of color and working class white people was clear. and was as apparent as we had been urging the city in terms of our resiliency advocacy. So what ended up happening was for the next 2 years, my organization and Align, as Josh will probably mention, started doing organizing and identifying what are some of the adaptation and resiliency capital projects that we need. Basically, what that means is what are the kind of projects that we need to make our city safer, right? What are what sorts of barriers are we looking at? What sorts of ways can we not just rebuild our city to make it safer, but at the same time maximize jobs in the process? Because that's one of the few things you can't outsource, which is disaster planning for your city, right? And so that began, and then maybe about a year and a half in, and by the way, our movement has a saying that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? So our strategy was to come up with a plan that we presented to the city before they came out with their rebuilding plan. That way we could hold them accountable and we could measure how open and transparent they were being based on the plans that we submitted. About a year and a half ago, when we're all in the midst of all this planning and pushing in the city to make sure our priorities are included, we get wind that in September, the UN is going to have a climate summit, first global climate summit, where for the first time, since the failure of the global agreement in Copenhagen, this is now being called as a UN priority right when the General Assembly is meeting. We start getting calls from our friends from 350 and folks from across the country saying, you guys in New York, whether you're planning for us or not, we're heading your way because we can't let this opportunity go. We've got to let the world know that the time for climate justice is now. That the communities and the countries that have contributed the least to climate change are going to be impacted first and worst. And that now is the time for us to make sure that we're getting this message out. So the 400,000 people that showed up in New York last fall was, I understand Philly alone said, 40 buses. That's not even the train. That was a one-time event that we needed to send a message, but the organizing was happening before that and since that. I'm not gonna go into this part of it. I'm gonna let Josh talk about it, but what was important to us in New York was not just the planning of this march, but to make sure that we use the energy and the momentum and the urgency of the moment to press our mayor and city council to, when the eyes of the world turn to the UN, make sure New York is ready with at least some sort of goal. And the goal that they came up with was the 80 by 50, 80% reduction of the city's greenhouse gases by 2050. It's ambitious, it's a lot, and you know how we get there, Josh is gonna tell us how we're gonna get there. So but in closing, I do wanna say one thing. This notion about resiliency, for those of you who are kind of getting familiar with that term, the common term is known as something that's bouncing back from a traumatic or a severe, or, you know, a horrific event, right? And for communities of color, communities from the South Bronx to Eastwood, right? Bouncing back to an inequitable, disproportionately burdened, racist, classist reality is not an option. We can't bounce back. We have to bounce forward. I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.